Now we're on. I'd like to welcome everyone. We have a nice crowd this afternoon. My name is George Arnold. I'm a member of the program committee of the Everett Jewish Life Center. The Everett Center is a Jewish house on Chautauqua campus, and it's our home for all things Jewish. We explore Jewish food, music, politics, anti-Semitism, history, literature, comedy, and on and on. We provide an opportunity to learn, debate, laugh, and explore our interests together. At a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise and Jews are feeling vulnerable, the Everett Center provides a venue for Jews and the larger community to examine some of the very important issues affecting the Jewish community. We are an important community within the larger Chautauqua community. This is the Everett Center's 16th year. It was built through a generous donation by Edith Everett and her family.
Here she is.
I know. And here she is, exactly. To memorialize her husband, Henry. It was Edith's vision to create a Jewish denominational house with outstanding programs that would be available to all for free of charge and where rooms would be available to house guests. Edith's vision has been more than realized. We are proud that we have a committed audience and are thrilled to attract new guests. Our audience continues to grow in numbers, as you can see by looking around the room. Who is here for the first time? Put your hands up. That's great. We're glad to have you, and we hope you'll come back for many more programs. You can introduce yourself to those of us who volunteer at the center. Everyone except me is wearing a badge with their name on it, so you'll know who they are. Our programs include 2 talks every week and Jewish film themes on Sunday and Wednesday. You'll find our activities in the brochure and on the screens in this room. This is the latest brochure. You can pick up a copy at the front or at the side here. We're always looking for volunteers, and we actually have a form if you're interested you can fill out. We welcome programming suggestions, and please let us know if you'd like to help. We're always looking for people who would like to volunteer. Our programming and operations are fully dependent on your donations. We do not get any financial support from Chautauqua Institution. The gate fees do not support our center here. Your tax-deductible gift helps the Everett Center make ours a home for Jewish thinkers and seekers from all streams of Judaism. It's our honor and our mission to develop programs that spark curiosity, intellect, and imagination, infused with our rich Jewish culture and tradition. As our regular attendees know, we offer a multitude of diverse opportunities that explore Judaism through a full spectrum of interests and passions. To continue our mission to expand our program and strengthen our community, we invite you to make a donation so that we can continue to offer programs without a charge. We have envelopes in the back of the room that you can use, and we also have a form with a QR code you can scan to help make contributions. So the center is for all of you. Please support it financially. There's a cost to everything we do, and please help us if you can. At this point, I'd like you to check your cell phones and make sure they're on silent, and anything that can make noise is silenced. So at this point, I'm ready to introduce our speaker, Dr. Daniel Greene. He is the subject matter expert at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University. In 2018, he curated Americans and the Holocaust, an exhibition that opened at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It was to commemorate the 25th anniversary. The exhibition also inspired a television series called U.S. and the Holocaust that was an Emmy nominated documentary directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein, and it aired on PBS in September of 2022. I'm sure many of you saw it like I did. Dr. Greene co-edited with Edward Phillips a book entitled Americans and the Holocaust, a Reader. It was published by Rutgers University Press in 2022. His first book, The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, the Menorah Association and American Diversity, published in 2011, won the American Jewish Historical Society's Paul Wiener Prize in 2012. and he spoke on that topic yesterday. From 2019 to 2023, Dr. Greene was president and librarian at the Newberry College in Chicago. His topic today will be Americans and the Holocaust.
Thank you, George. I just want to say, as I said yesterday, how wonderful it is to be invited to Chautauqua to speak, and specifically to the Everett Center. I'm so grateful to Edith Everett and everyone here who makes this possible. And it's nice to see faces who were here yesterday. There were wonderful questions during the program, and they continued after the program. They continued this morning at breakfast with good coffee. So I just appreciate how engaged everyone is. So thank you for hosting us. It's been wonderful. So today I'm going to talk, as George said, I'm going to talk about the research that we did for an exhibition called Americans and the Holocaust that is still up at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and that inspired the documentary directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein. This is also now a traveling exhibition that's going to visit 100 libraries around the country between 2022 and 2026, including about a third of those libraries are college and university libraries. So at our approach to this history, I'm not going to give you all the answers today. I'm going to give you difficult questions. And that is our approach to this history, to ask difficult questions about what Americans knew about Nazism in real time during the 1930s and 40s, and maybe to suggest a little bit what more might have been done. What we're really trying to do what I was really trying to do in this project is push visitors to a much more difficult question to ask and to wrestle with, which is, if Americans knew so much, and one of the takeaways today is that Americans had a lot of access to information about the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews in real time as it was happening. If we knew so much, if we Americans knew so much, why didn't rescue of Jews become a priority for the US government or for most American people? And we can answer those questions. One of the key things to understand about how the United States responds to atrocities abroad is to look at domestic conditions at home. Domestic conditions deeply shape how we have responded to atrocities abroad, to this genocide, and to other genocides that have taken place since. So we need to look at what's going on in the United States. What did America look like before 1933, before the Nazis rise to power, and we see democracy fall apart relatively quickly in Germany. So here we see a veteran on the street in Philadelphia. This is 1935. He's blind. He's wearing a sign that says, "I gave my eyes," and he's selling a newspaper to support himself, local news, which we just heard about from Margaret Sullivan this morning. Americans were asked frequently in public opinion polls during the 1930s, was it a mistake for the United States to have entered World War I? And usually 70% of Americans said yes, that it was a mistake. We're an isolationist nation. We pull back from international affairs. And remember, in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, World War I is 15 years in the rearview mirror. It's living memory for most Americans. So we see scenes like this of families visiting the grave sites of Americans who were lost during World War I. We call ourselves a nation of immigrants during this period. This is New York Harbor. We think of ourselves as a land of refuge, but the realities on the ground are a little bit different, or actually more than a little bit different. And that's really mostly what I'm going to focus on today. But to just give you a little more sense of the context of the United States, we see the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan in the United States. This is Washington, D.C. in 1925. The Ku Klux Klan obviously is a white supremacist organization. discrimination against African Americans, against Catholics, against Jews. They're trying to draw stark boundaries around who is included when we talk about who's American. This harkens back to some things I was talking about yesterday. And the Klan obviously also, they use multiple means, including horrific violence, to enforce their vision of what the United States should look like. It's a segregated nation in the 1930s. This is North Carolina. We see a segregated drinking fountain. Public facilities are segregated. Churches are segregated. Schools are segregated. Neighborhoods are segregated. And not only throughout the South. And again, this segregation is often enforced through violence. And then in 1929, we see the bottom drop out of the American economy. This is my hometown of Chicago. This is a soup kitchen that was run by Al Capone, the great humanitarian Al Capone. If you know Chicago well, this is on State Street, the 900 block of South State Street. In 1933, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt takes office, 25% of working age Americans are unemployed. This is going to be a long depression. We really don't get out of this depression until World War II starts, until we get into World War II. It's not linear. Our recovery is not linear. The economy goes up and down. I'll talk about how bad it was again in 1937 and 1938 when things are getting worse and worse for Jews who are living under Nazism as well. But 25% unemployment. For Americans in 1929, for almost everyone alive, it's the worst economy they've ever known. And it lasts and lasts. So that's all what comes before 1933. That's what the United States looks like before 1933. And we look abroad and we see this. We see a new world leader, and in Germany, arguably the most advanced, enlightened country in Europe, and we see democracy fall apart very quickly. Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany on January 30th of 1933. I'm not going to talk much about the history of the Nazi Party or all of what brought him into power, but I'm happy to take questions about that if you want. The key thing to say is that within 6 months of January of 1933, all other political parties in Germany are illegal. Fascism, one of the ways to understand fascism is the leader is the party and the party is the state. Right? That's what happens in fascism. The leader is the party and the party is the state, and that happens very, very quickly in Germany. The Nazi Party becomes the state. Key measures like changing the flag of Germany to the swastika flag, right? Those symbols and those kind of actions are actually very, very important for understanding how fascism progresses. So we have representatives over there. The U.S. government has representatives over there in Germany, and they're well aware of what's going on. George Messerschmitt is one of the leading U.S. representatives over there. He's a U.S. consul in Germany at the time, and you can see here he's writing back from Berlin in June of 1933, saying the situation of Jews in Germany is a most deplorable one, and I see no future for them in this country. Just a little side tangent on historical thinking. There's a danger in looking at a quote like this from 1933 and saying, oh, we should have known. We should have known that genocide was coming for the Jews. The Nazis didn't know that genocide was coming for the Jews in 1933. The Nazis did not come to power with a plan to murder all the Jews of Europe. They envisioned a Germany that was free of Jews, but they didn't know exactly how they would get there, and they learn along the way. And what they call the final solution to the Jewish question, the idea of murdering all the Jews in Europe, comes later. So I guess what I'm asking us all to do is put aside hindsight a little bit, which is hard. It's hard to put aside hindsight when we're looking at this history, but what we do know is that the American press and American government representatives were very concerned, and so, at least in Messerschmitt's words, saw no future for Jews in Germany. FDR has trouble finding someone to nominate as an ambassador to Germany. If you've read Eric Larson's book, In the Garden of Beasts, you know about this man, William Dodd, who was a history professor at the University of Chicago, actually where I got my PhD, PhD in that department. He was completely unprepared for this job. He writes about the American South, the economy of the American South, and he thought he could go to Germany as an ambassador and get some writing done. But when he goes over, and you're seeing coverage of this here from the Chicago Tribune in October of 1933, he's preparing for his first meeting with Hitler. And the first item on Dodd's agenda in his first meeting with Hitler in October of 1933 is to talk to Hitler about the fact that there had been multiple attacks on American Jews in the streets of Germany in the summer of 1933. In our research, we counted at least 36 attacks on Americans. Most of them were Jews, not only men. There's 2 stories of pregnant women who are attacked, who lose their child as a result of these brutal attacks. So that's item number 1, right? Dodd is the highest ranking American in Germany, and his job is to protect American citizens. So he goes to Hitler and he says in this meeting, these attacks on Americans have to stop on the streets of Germany. And Hitler says, all right, they'll stop. And the attacks do stop. Hitler is a smart propagandist, right? The attacks on Jews, on German Jews, don't stop. And Dodd doesn't say anything about the attacks on German Jews because that's not within the boundaries of what he is supposed to be representing there. But what's learned in Washington at that time is maybe we can negotiate with this guy, right? Maybe he is more reasonable. We're 9 months into his reign, maybe this is as bad as it will get. And Jews in Germany all along were also thinking, maybe this is as bad as it will get. The persecution doesn't stop, but as Jews are living through it, again, this is an encouragement to kind of push against hindsight. As Jews are living through this, things seem so bad to them, but there's this narrative of, this is awful, but it can't get worse than this. And you can see that by reading diaries of people of Jews who were living in Germany at that time. It also speaks to the fact that the US government was going to recognize Germany's national sovereignty, right? The US government is not going to tell another sovereign nation how to run its nation, right? They're going to try to protect their own citizens who are living there, but they're not going to go beyond that. So that's kind of just a snapshot of some of these early moments. And again, just to remind you of what's on Americans' minds in these early moments. 1936, this is when FDR is elected for his second term. FDR has almost no foreign policy during his first term. His entire first term is about the New Deal, is about trying to lift Americans out of this depression. But even in November 1936, Americans are asked, do you think there'll be another serious depression? And 67% say yes. They're asked, again, I mentioned this, do you think it was a mistake for the US to enter World War I? This is in January of 37, and 70% saying no. And I mentioned this one yesterday in response to a question, do you think the persecution of Jews in Europe has been their own fault in April of 1928? And if you add up the partly, which is 54%, and the entirely, which is 11%, you get to about 2/3 of Americans thinking that the persecution of Jews in Europe has been their own fault. So it gives you a sense of the anti-Semitism in the United States. Something bad is happening to Jews over there. Well, it must be the fault of something that Jews over there are doing, is what many Americans think. So 1938 is a huge turning point for how Americans understand the threat of Nazism. In the spring of 1938, the Nazis annex Austria in an event known as the Anschluss, the annexation. Now, the Nazis had taken areas of other territories before, but what Americans start to understand in the spring of 1938 is that Hitler has much greater territorial ambitions in Europe than just in Germany. Nazism had been pretty much confined to Germany for 5 years until that point. FDR calls a conference, an international conference of nations, to talk about the refugee problem. They meet in Evian, France, and 32 nations come together and they all say, this refugee problem is horrible. Let us tell you why we can't do anything about it. Except for one, the only nation that offers to take any refugees is the Dominican Republic, and there's a whole not so pretty history to that, to the reasons why they wanted to take Jewish refugees. So the world is aware that there's a refugee crisis for Jews, and the United States and other nations are hoping that someone else will deal with it. And then in November of 1938, you get a nationwide terrorist attack against Jews in Germany by the German government. We know it as Kristallnacht, or the November pogrom. Over 2 days, November 9th and 10th of 1938, hundreds of shops, hundreds of synagogues are destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men are rounded up and arrested and sent to concentration camps. I'm showing you the Dallas Morning News here from November of 1938. The headline says, "Hysterical Nazis wreck thousands of Jewish shops, burn synagogues in wild orgy of looting and terror." And this really connects to what Margaret Sullivan was saying this morning. I could have picked any local newspaper in November of 1938 and showed you headlines, and you would see banner headlines, including the Dunkirk Evening Observer. I was looking for the paper that was closest to this location. New persecution against the Jews. You can see in the second column over from the left how Nazis terrorized Jews. 2 more columns over to the right. Jews of Vienna denied access to food supply. Kristallnacht is the biggest story about American persecution, about the Nazis' persecution of Jews in this 12-year period. We learn, in the United States, we learn in 1942, 4 years later, that the Nazis have a plan to murder all the Jews of Europe, but this is a bigger story. This story stays on the front pages of American newspapers for 2 to 3 weeks in November of 1938. It's hard to think about stories, especially foreign news stories, that stay on the front page for 2 to 3 weeks. But Kristallnacht does. Just to prove the point, this is the Los Angeles Examiner. This is November 23rd of 1938. Kristallnacht is November 9th and 10th. So we're 2 weeks after. Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies. The Gallup organization goes out and polls about this. And just the fact that Gallup is asking these questions shows the extent of information that Americans had. So 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, in November of 1938, Gallup asked, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And you can see how overwhelming it is. 94% of Americans disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany. And they're asked a follow-up question, which is this. Should we allow more Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% say no. This is really the crux, I think, of understanding Americans' response to Nazism. The Time magazine at the time calls it sympathy without action. There's a lot of sympathy without action on the part of Americans. And no matter what we learn, no matter what Americans learn over the next 7 years to the end of World War II, this number doesn't change very much. I'll come back to that idea at the end of the talk today. So what about the role of the president? Here we have the Baltimore Sun, just a couple days after Kristallnacht, a banner headline, Roosevelt denounces Nazis. So President Roosevelt was really very skilled at handling the press. And he had press conferences, informal press conferences, very frequently, where reporters would come into his office and gather around his desk, and he would shape the news. He would tell them what to report on. And these press conferences were off the record. And if you broke that rule, you weren't invited back to the press conference, right, as a reporter. So the stakes were high to keep it off the record. And on this one, a few days after Kristallnacht, the reporters walk into the room, and Roosevelt says, boys, and they were mostly men, he says, boys, this one is on the record. So he wanted to be quoted, and he says in this press conference, I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in a 20th century civilization, right? So he denounces Nazism, as you can see here, and so there's a good reporter in the room who says, all right, so are we going to open our doors to more refugees? And Roosevelt says, no, we have a quota system in place. right? This quota system that I talked about yesterday. There's a very restrictive immigration quota system in place where the United States is not issuing very many visas annually, and the limit is low, and the United States is far under issuing that limit. So it goes back to the law that I was talking about yesterday, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924, that establishes quotas based on the country in which you were born, that sets a cap at about 150,000 immigrants per year, although most years during the 1930s, the United States comes nowhere close to letting in 150,000 immigrants. Consular officials in Europe get to make the decisions, at least until 1941. And as I said yesterday, it's written by anti-immigration lobbyists. The Representative Johnson from the state of Washington is a nativist and an anti-Semite who writes this law. So there are people out there who speak up on behalf of the refugees, and one of the ones that I wish was better remembered is a journalist named Dorothy Thompson. She, as you can see here, she has a radio show on NBC. She's syndicated in hundreds of newspapers in the United States, and she writes a little book in 1938. The book is just titled Refugees, and in it, she's arguing that the United States should be taking in more refugees. And she writes, it's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times, that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. She's talking about all the forms that you need to immigrate into the United States, the maddening bureaucracy. I think frequently about this letter that Albert Einstein, who himself a Jewish refugee who came here in 1933, Albert Einstein writes a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, to the First Lady, in either 1940 or 1941. And he's trying to get her to convince her husband to help with opening or liberalizing our immigration laws. And Einstein writes, your government has erected a wall of bureaucratic measures to keep immigrants out, right? So we talk about walls that keep immigrants out. In the 1940s and the 1930s, it was a bureaucratic wall. And it was designed to be very hard to scale that wall. There won't be a quiz on this, but I just want to give you a sense of what you need at the time to get an immigration visa into the United States. And I'm not going to read off all of these, but a couple things to understand is some of these forms, you had to line up these forms in order sometimes, and some of them had very short expiration dates. So sometimes you'd have to go back and start over. Many of these forms are expensive. And some of them, I think, could be quite harrowing. If you look here, certificate of good conduct from German police authorities, right? So that meant if you're a Jew in Germany and you want to leave, you need to go to a Gestapo office and get that form, right? So that could be quite terrifying. Ship passage, that's a ship ticket, right? Ship tickets were very expensive at this time as well. And you needed a sponsor in the United States who would sponsor your immigration. Remember, we're still in the depths of a depression. There's a rhetoric of we can't let any immigrants in. We don't have any jobs here for Americans. So you needed a sponsor who would guarantee that you were not at what at the time was called likely to become a public charge. This LPC clause, likely to become a public charge. You needed someone who would guarantee that they would take care of you financially. And if your sponsor was not a relative, the US government was much more skeptical of that sponsor. Sponsorship was very expensive. I've looked at thousands of cases of immigrants and refugees trying to come into the United States. And the numbers vary, but it's often around $2,000 or $2,500 per person in late 1930s, which would be about $50,000 to $60,000 today. Not per family, but per person. So Jews who are trying to leave Germany really get caught. I think of it as kind of an economic vice. You may know that to leave Germany, you had to let the Nazis rob you of your assets. Right? You couldn't, as a Jewish person, you couldn't take any assets out of Germany. I mean, you could take pocket change, 10 Reichsmarks or something like that. So you had to list all your assets in order for the Nazis to rob you of those assets. And then to enter the United States, you had to prove that you weren't going to become a public charge. right? So how do you do that? You start to see graphics and maps like this in American newspapers. This is from the Oakland, California Tribune in 1938, asking how many refugees can we take? And you can see here, what you see, I realize it's hard to see, but the countries in black are Nazi occupied, and each country has two numbers under it. To the left is an estimate of the number of Jews living in that country at that time. And the estimates are pretty good. Germany says 3.25 million. Hungary says 444,000. Romania is nearly 1 million. Germany says 550,000, which is too high for 1938. There may have been 550,000 in 1933, but a couple 100,000 had left over those 5 years. On the right of the dash, you see much smaller numbers. That is the maximum number of visas that the US government could issue in a year, in any given year, to people born in those countries. So as you go south and east, those numbers get very, very small, right? Germany is 27,370, but Poland is 6,524. We could issue, the US government had 377 visas to issue annually to people born in Romania. Even if the US government issued all the visas that it could have, that doesn't save the Jews of Europe. There's no way through our immigration system that the United States could have stopped the Holocaust. And as I've said, the sad fact is also that we under-issue visas. These are maximums, and the US government does not get to these maximums during 1938. So you can see here, I just picked 4 countries, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Romania. The quota is the total number of visas that we could issue in a year, and I just picked January 1st of 1939 to show you the number of applicants. So the waiting list in Germany by 1939 is 9 years. The waiting list in Romania is 43 years long by 1939. In 1939, then the U.S. government, there are some within the U.S. government who are going to try to make some alternative proposals. And you get a bill in Congress from Senator Robert Wagner of New York. He's a Democrat, co-sponsored by a Republican Congresswoman named Edith Norse Rogers. It's known as the Wagner-Rogers bill. And as you can see here, it says admission of German refugee children, but everyone knew they were talking about Jews. And the bill says, let's let in 10,000 children a year in 1939 and another 10,000 in 1940. And let's not count them against the immigration quota system. Let's do something that's humanitarian. Unaccompanied children, their parents would stay behind. Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the loudest champions of this bill. She says, I think it's a wise way to do a humanitarian act. Other nations take their share of child refugees, and it seems a fair thing to do. For those of you who know this history, she's talking about the Kindertransport, right? Other nations take their share. There are 10,000 children or so unaccompanied who make it into Great Britain. The loudest voices against this bill are Southern white Democrats like Senator Robert Reynolds out of North Carolina, who says on the floor of Congress, let's keep America for our boys and girls. Let's give American jobs to American citizens. Let's save America for Americans, our country, our citizens first. And it's Reynolds who is much more representative of public opinion. Gallup polls on this too. Should 10,000 refugee children be brought into this country and taken into American homes? And you can see that 2/3 of Americans say no. So Reynolds, the senator from North Carolina, goes behind the scenes to Wagner, the Senator Robert Wagner from New York, and he says, look, let's cut a deal. I'll give you your bill. We can have this child refugee bill. In exchange, I want immigration for the next 5 years in the United States to be at absolute zero. No other immigrants. And Wagner says, look, that's not a deal, right? And so Wagner doesn't take that deal, pulls the bill, and this bill never even makes it to the floor for a vote. This bill, the Wagner-Rogers bill, never makes it out of committee. And so the United States has no equivalent to a child refugee program like the Kindertransport. Historians argue about this. We may have let in about 1,400, maybe 1,600 unaccompanied children, during the Nazi period, often at the behest of some really extraordinary organizations that work on bringing child refugees here. Organizations like the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers are very active. An organization that no longer exists called the German Jewish Children's Aid that was founded to help refugee children. There are some Mennonites who that work very hard to bring in refugees. And then, of course, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was known as the Joint, at the time brought in, did what they could to aid refugees as well. But the U.S. government has no program for unaccompanied child refugees at the time. Europe goes to war then in 1939, and it becomes much more difficult after September of 1939 for the U.S. For refugees, to cross the Atlantic. And so one of the tragedies of this history, this is something that the historian Deborah Lipstadt, who's now become an ambassador, says in the film, in the Ken Burns film that we were both in. She says, one of the tragedies of this history is that when the U.S. could have done the most, which is in the 1930s, by letting in refugees, we didn't know what was to come. And by the time we do learn that the Nazis have a plan to murder all the Jews of Europe, it's too late. And it's too late in large part because of the war. But between 1939 and 1941, you may know that the United States is really caught up in a debate about isolationism or interventionism, right? Should we get into this war or should we stay out of it? And that becomes really the obsession for most Americans. Here, what this guy is doing is illegal, but he was caught by a photographer quickly. This is 1939, a protester hanging signs on the White House saying, FDR, you're preparing for war, you fight it. And FDR takes to the airwaves, gives a fireside chat 2 days after Germany invades Poland and World War II begins, and he says, this nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. FDR is going to spend almost all of his political capital in the next 2 years trying to move Americans from isolation to intervention in this war. He's going to spend none of his political capital on the immigration question or on Jewish refugees. FDR liked to fight battles that he could win. He especially learns that after the court packing scandal in 1937. You don't see him after 1937 pick as many controversial issues, and he's going to go all in on moving us towards intervention. But he knows that public opinion is against letting in more refugees. Now, that's one of the difficult questions we want to raise in this exhibition. When should a president try to lead public opinion, and when do we see presidents follow public opinion? But on the immigration question, we really see FDR follow public opinion. We see isolationist organizations like the America First Committee. This is a propaganda poster saying that war's first casualty will be liberty itself, with the missile going through the arm of the Statue of Liberty. And this man on the left, Charles Lindbergh, becomes the outspoken advocate of this isolationist America First movement. Lindbergh, outside of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, may have been the most famous American at the time. He had flown across the Atlantic solo in 1927. This is 14 years later. And what starts out as an anti-war organization becomes a very anti-Semitic organization. Here we see a rally with Lindbergh speaking at the podium. They always invoke George Washington. And you see their language, defend America first. Lindbergh gives a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, in September of 1941, a famous speech in September of 1941 in Des Moines, Iowa, where he asks, right, we're getting towards, I mean, Americans don't know this, but we're getting towards Pearl Harbor. We've been debating for 2 years at this point whether we should get involved in the war. And he gives a speech that's known as the War Agitator speech. If you Google Lindbergh War Agitators, you can read this speech. And he says, there's really three groups that want the U.S. to go to war. So let's look at those three groups. The first group is the British. And he says, of course, this makes sense, right? All of Western Europe has fallen to Nazism by this point. He says, of course the British want us to go to war to defend them. They're the last line of defense in Europe. He says the second group that wants us to go to war is the FDR's administration. And why? Well, because FDR is a warmonger, and he's been lying to you all along, and FDR needs this war to cement his power. And there were people at the time who called FDR a dictator already. Remember, he's in his third term, right, which is unprecedented. When he runs for a third term in 1940, those who were against him in the U.S. say we don't need dictators here in the United States. And Lindbergh and Roosevelt hate each other. There's a great book about this by a historian named Lynn Olson called Those Angry Days, if you want to read about Lindbergh versus Roosevelt. And then Lindbergh says, and the third group that wants us to go to war are the Jews. And he doesn't deny what's happening in Europe. He says, of course they want us to go to war. The persecution of Jews in Europe is very, very troubling. But then he pivots and he threatens Jews in the United States. He says, but if we go to war, there'll be a huge backlash of anti-Semitism here in the United States. And do you really want that? Do you American Jews really want that? And then he says, and where are we getting our messages that we should go to war? Well, we're getting them in part from the American press. And isn't that because Jews control the press? And you're seeing all these interventionist movies come out of Hollywood now. Anti-Nazi movies come out of Hollywood. We didn't used to see anti-Nazi movies in the 30s. Now we do. Well, isn't that because Jews control Hollywood, right? So he slips into all these anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish conspiratorial control. The speech is actually received very negatively, and many people, you start to see headlines in the United States asking, is Lindbergh a Nazi? But he is saying something that I think he's saying aloud something I think that many Americans think at the time. One of the best responses to Lindbergh comes from a political cartoonist named Theodore Geisel, who's early in his career. We now know him as Dr. Seuss. This is his cartoon from September of 1941 after Lindbergh's speech. And you see a mother, or maybe a grandmother, wearing an America First sweater. She's reading her children a terrifying story called Adolf the Wolf. And the caption is, and the wolf chewed up their children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, and it didn't really matter. So it harkens back even to the failed Wagner-Rogers bill. If you want to see more of these cartoons, there's a great website out of UC San Diego called Dr. Seuss Goes to War. Theodore Geisel's archive is at UC San Diego, and they did a fantastic book and web exhibition called Dr. Seuss Goes to War, which is just great. So this is only settled by war, right? December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. That's what settles our isolation intervention debate. Our first response in the United States to that war is to round up our own citizens, people of Japanese descent and Japanese American citizens, and to move them inland to what at the time was called by some media concentration camps. These are not death camps, of course, but this is the Crisis, actually, the magazine of the NAACP that's writing, color seems to be the only reason why thousands of American citizens of Japanese ancestry are in concentration camps. Anyway, there are no Italian Americans or German American citizens in such camps. But this speaks to the climate of fear and fear of foreign influence in the United States that also helps to keep refugees out. Now, I've been saying in 1942, we learn about the plan to murder all the Jews of Europe. And I'll tell this story quickly so that we have time for questions. I'm getting to the end. But this is a telegram that was intended, you can see here, for Rabbi Stephen Wise. It was sent on August 29th of 1942, and it says in part, I'll start here, received alarming report that in Führer's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration, all Jews in countries occupied or controlled Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should after deportation and concentration in East, at one blow exterminated to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe. There's a long history, a twisted history to how representatives of the World Jewish Congress in Geneva got this information. Stephen Wise, a rabbi in New York at the Free Synagogue, is the head of the World Jewish Congress, and they're trying to get this information to him. So they send this telegram to the State Department, and the State Department blocks it from getting to Wise. They dismiss this. In the words of the State Department, they call this an unreliable war rumor. This telegram was also sent to a member of Parliament named Samuel Silverman, and they can't stop a member of Parliament in Britain from sending it to Wise. So that's how it gets to Wise, Rabbi Wise. He goes to Washington, D.C. He meets with the Assistant Secretary of State, a man named Sumner Welles, in August of 1942. And he says, is this true? And Welles says, give us time. We need to investigate. So the State Department takes 3 months. And 3 months later, they call Wise back and they say, it is true. This is happening. We're not going to say anything about it, but we're not going to stop you from saying anything about it. So Wise is at Union Station in Washington, D.C., taking a train back to New York, and he has a meeting with a wire service reporter and tells them this story. And by November of 1942, you see headlines like this in American newspapers. Again, this is the Los Angeles Times, Nazis wiping out Jews in cold blood. My colleague, Rebecca Erbelding, who spoke here last year, has written a great book about this era of the State Department's response and the way that actually folks from the Treasury Department call out the failures of the State Department that leads to a change in American policy. But this is not what was on Americans' minds. This is what the war looked like. These are propaganda posters from 1943 issued by the US government. So you see a dagger going through a Bible, right? The Nazis are the enemy of Christianity. On this one on the right, the hand has a swastika ring on it and it's crushing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and our founding documents are on fire. 2 more propaganda posters. Nazism is an enemy of American children. There's a looming swastika in the grass here. These are actually efforts to raise money for war bonds. What you don't see here, Europe's Jews, right? That's not what the war is about for Americans. And one of the things that in this project, in this exhibition and film that we're asking people to struggle with is the fact that the Nazis are going to fight 2 wars. The Nazis fight a war against the Allies, and the Nazis fight a war to destroy the Jews of Europe. And those 2 wars are equally important to the Nazis. And in response, the Allies are going to fight 1 war. The Allies fight a war to save democracy and defeat fascism. They do not fight a war to rescue Jews, ever. And so we talk about questions like, why didn't we bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz? Because that's not what the war was about, ever, for the US government. That's not an anomaly. That's in fact entirely consistent with the fact that the war was about rescuing democracy and defeating fascism, but not about rescuing Jews. So where are we left in 1945? I'll close in 1945 and then we'll have time for questions. And I'm kind of going to leave you with a on the one hand, on the other hand. Here we see, this is April of 1945. We see General Eisenhower right here with his hands on his hips. This is Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald in Germany, and we can see some of the horrors here that Eisenhower is seeing. And Eisenhower says 2 things that I think are so critical in April of 1945 when he encounters this. The first thing he says is, everything we've read to date has been an understatement. No one has access, well, maybe FDR does, but few people have more access to information than Eisenhower does. Right? And I've been showing you everything that Americans could read at the time. We didn't see scenes like this until April and May of 1945. I think for Americans in 1945, seeing is believing. I'm worried in 2024 that seeing might not be believing anymore. But in April of 1945, seeing is believing. So the fact that Eisenhower says everything we've read to date has been an understatement. The other thing he says is we need to get US newspaper editors here immediately, and we need to get members of Congress here immediately so that this is never attributed to propaganda. And that actually happens, but the fact that in April of 1945, Eisenhower himself is concerned about what we today would call Holocaust denial is really telling. At home, this is Life magazine, one of the most popular magazines in the United States at the time. This is May 7th of 1945. We see here a boy walking along the side of the road at Bergen-Belsen, and these are images of Buchenwald as well. If you flip the pages, there's horrific photographs of another camp called Nordhausen that American soldiers encounter. So Americans are seeing this. May 7th of 1945. The article itself, this is the entirety of the article, actually doesn't mention Jews at all. So our sense of the Holocaust as a crime distinct from the crimes of World War II has not yet fully developed in May of 1945. But this is May 7th of 1945, and this is May 8th of 1945 in Times Square, right? Victory in Europe Day. We went to war to defeat Nazism, and we won. And we should never, in talking about Americans' response to the Holocaust, neglect to mention, right, that 16 million Americans serve. 400,000 Americans die. Many Americans who stay on the home front make really significant sacrifices. But the war is not about rescuing Jews. The war is about defeating Nazism. And as uncomfortable as that leaves us, those are two very separate things during this war from 1942 to 1945 that the U.S. is involved in. And just to prove the point, I'll leave you with one last poll. So 6 months after this, in December of 1945, when there is now a huge problem of hundreds of thousands of displaced persons in Europe, Jews who have no home to go back to, Americans are asked, should we permit more persons from Europe to come to this country each year than we did before the war? Should we keep the number around the same, or should we reduce the number? And you can see here that 5% of Americans want to let in more refugees, and 37% want to let in fewer. So on the one hand, the United States is fundamentally transformed by our encounter with Nazism. In every subsequent atrocity throughout the world will look to the United States first and say, how is the United States going to respond? That was not true in 1933. It is true after 1945. But on this question, and especially for a nation that imagines itself as a nation of immigrants, right, and that has been a nation of immigrants, I think we have to struggle with the fact that both things are true. We are a nation of immigrants, and we're a nation that sometimes in moments of deep crisis has closed our doors to immigrants. And we don't see that change even during this encounter with Nazism. So thank you. We have some time for questions. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. If you want to ask a question, if you can approach the mic that's in this room, that's great. If not, I can also repeat the question. Yes.
Rabbi Weiss talked to Roosevelt a number of times.
He did.
And Roosevelt, according to American Jews, was all for American Jews. That's the impression that the Jews in America received.
Yeah.
Weiss did not ever change that opinion.
Right.
And he was responsible, I think, more than anybody else he could have done, but he did not do it because he was a friend of Roosevelt.
Yeah, so the question is about Rabbi Stephen Wise and about his close relationship with Roosevelt. And he did have access to Roosevelt, and you're right, he met with President Roosevelt multiple times. And he is a figure that historians really do argue about, of should he have pushed Roosevelt harder to do more about the crisis for Jews in Europe. Some criticize him for prioritizing his own access right to Roosevelt over helping Jews in Europe. Again, there's a lot of controversy among historians about this. I would really recommend a book called FDR and the Jews by two historians named Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman, who dig deeply into this. There are other figures. I mean, this raises another important question about this history. When you want to change policy, when you want to change U.S. government policy, do you scream from the rooftops, or do you try to work quietly behind the scenes? Wise actually does both. In 1933, Wise organizes a rally in Madison Square Garden where 20,000 people show up to have an anti-Nazi rally. So there are moments, and Wise is involved with a boycott of German goods. One of the tough things about looking at Americans' response also is I think you get these moments of protest, but you don't get a sustained anti-Nazi movement in the United States that lasts. It's hard for protests to turn into movements. And we don't see an anti-Nazi movement. But you're right that Wise has been quite a controversial figure in this history. Yes?
Yes, I think the nature of the Jewish population in America has changed. I don't think that could happen today. You know, there's never again Jews are more activists, they're more secure here. Can you speak to that?
Well, the position of Jews, yeah, this is a good question. It's about the position of Jews in the United States in the 1930s and now, and I should have said this. Jews are much less at home in America in the 1930s, arguably, than they are now. We see, I was trying to suggest this with showing the Klan and talking about Lindbergh. We see a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States in the 1930s, and anti-Semitism is on the rise. There are pro-Nazi organizations like the German-American Bund. If you followed some of the work that Rachel Maddow has done recently about pro-Nazi sentiment in even within the U.S. Congress. So Jews in the United States, many Jews, are concerned that if they speak out too loudly, we will see that backlash of anti-Semitism that Lindbergh is warning against. One historian has estimated that there's 100 new anti-Semitic organizations founded in the United States in the 1930s. And so that does Jews' own feeling, and again, like I said yesterday, Jews are not a monolith. Almost all Jews in the United States are anti-Nazi, but they don't agree what to do about it. They don't agree about what the tactics should be to fight Nazism and to try to get the government to change. And a lot of that, when you dig into the disagreements within American Jewish communities, you see a lot of concerns about how, for a shorthand, how at home are Jews in the United States. And that is, that's a situation that's different, 80, 90 years ago than it is today.
I remember going to the museum, probably in the early 2000s, I think, and they were showing, I think, a documentary that was Americans and the Holocaust kind of thing, but it wasn't the Ken Burns thing.
Right.
And I was, being a boomer, I was totally shocked by what they said about the New York Times.
Yeah.
And how they buried all the articles about what was going on in Germany and the second, third, fourth part of the paper and so on. So and then I went to the Holocaust Museum like maybe 10 years later, and I saw your exhibit before it was headlined on PBS or whatever. And your show today showed that these papers were doing it all around the country, and that was different than what the New York Times, according to the museum's documentary, showed. So I'm just wondering, why is that disconnect in those two things?
Okay, great. There's been a lot of controversy around the New York Times. There's a book written about this called "Buried by the Times," about whether this story was buried. Where they count how many front page stories the New York Times included about the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews. What we were trying to do. And that's a useful angle for looking at this. And yet, the New York Times, obviously, is the paper of record, but it's not read by nearly as many people in the 1930s and 40s as it is today. This is relevant to what Margaret Sullivan was saying. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think there's something like 1,300 daily newspapers in the country in the 1930s. There are over a dozen in New York City alone. So what we were trying to do, so most Americans don't read the New York Times, and arguably most New Yorkers don't read the New York Times in the 1930s. I'm not saying that to apologize for the Times' failings, but what we were trying to do in this project was kind of widen the aperture to look at all of the United States, to look at local papers. We did a fantastic project at the Holocaust Museum called History Unfolded, where we asked people to go into their local archives, their local historical societies. We gave them targeted dates and said, take a picture with your phone and upload the newspaper articles. And we hoped that we would get a couple thousand newspaper articles. We got 50,000 newspaper articles uploaded from across the country. So this is both, what it proved to us is that there was widespread coverage. And it's also now kind of a database that future historians or others could look at and mine for new research. And it speaks to a key point in the exhibition, right? If we didn't know anything, if Americans didn't have information, how could we expect a kind of fulsome response to Nazism? What we were trying to show was, look at how much information you had. And it didn't matter if you were reading the Baltimore Sun or the Dunkirk Evening News or the Sacramento Bee or the Chicago Tribune, wherever you are, wherever you were, if you were paying attention, and that's a big if, right? But if you were paying attention, you could have known what was going on. And so then to ask, right, if we didn't know anything, how could you expect a response? But we're trying to say, look how much you could have, what could have been known. Why wasn't there a greater response? Yes.
I was wondering, in your research, have you seen anything to support or not to support the role of the Pope in the Catholic Church at that point in time?
Yeah. There's a lot of great work on this.
I've heard
This is,
both
yeah,
sides.
the questions about the role of the Pope, and this is really outside of my expertise at looking at Americans' response, but I'd recommend work by David Kurtzer, who has written multiple books on the Pope's response. What we know about this is there's still a lot to learn. The Vatican really only in the past few years has started to open their archive to historians, in part out of a lot of work that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has done with other bodies around the world to have a more evidence-based look at the Pope's response. But certainly, right, I mean, today I'm talking about the U.S. and the failures of the U.S., but the U.S. is not alone. Thank you. Yes.
Just an interesting anecdote. Charles Lindbergh's last 3 physicians were all Jewish. His senior physician and his 2 senior medical residents.
Wow.
That was a few days before he died.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that story.
So I'm less sanguine about what one of the folks had pointed out before in terms of Jews are perhaps more assimilated, more a part of America than they were previously in the 30s.
Yeah.
Yet we're a minuscule of the population.
Right.
German Jews in 1930s, I think, were half of 1% or
That's
something akin to that. We're, 15 to 18 million worldwide Jews. We've just recently recovered the population that existed in the 30s. So I'm less sanguine, especially when I hear people marching with torches down a Virginia hill saying Jews won't replace us. What do we learn from history? How can we, either as Jews, whether we're, just as Jews, as people, how do we not forget, and how do we prevent something like this? I know you're not a soothsayer or a prophet, but what can we take away from history?
Well, all right. I mean, you might not love some of my answers, but I'll give them to you. It's a really important question. What do we learn from history? I don't think that encountering this history and then simply saying never again is very effective, right? Because it happens again and again. Right? We've seen multiple genocides since the Holocaust, right? So never again feels a little bit like an empty promise. I think, look, there are multiple lessons that you could learn, though, and I'll do these quickly because I know we're a little bit over time. One is I don't think we have any excuse for being shocked by atrocities. Right? One of the sad lessons of this history is if we can imagine something, human beings will do that to each other, right? So when I'm teaching at Northwestern and I encounter undergraduates, sometimes I say, who learned in their high school class that this is about man's inhumanity to man? And a lot of hands go up, and I say, this isn't about inhumanity, this is humanity. This is what human beings do to each other, and we have to face that. That's part of it. Now, we do see in this history, and I didn't really focus on it today, we do see a lot of people stand up, and Dorothy Thompson is one of them. Try to use a voice to raise information. We see Americans, this is covered in the exhibition, some Americans take extraordinary risks, financial but also physical, to aid refugees. We need to look at those people and ask, why do they act the way that they do? And other people don't, and how do we get more people to act that way? So I don't want students to encounter this history and feel entirely hopeless, and we have to look at those stories of people who are able to make a difference. The last lesson that I'll mention quickly is a really haunting one, but it's one I think about all the time. And there's a colleague of mine at Northwestern named Peter Hayes, who is a fantastic historian of the Holocaust, who has written a book, it's just called Why, Explaining the Holocaust. And at the end of the book, he looks at Germany in the spring of 1933 when Hitler rises to power. And he looks at people who had power who did not stand up against Hitler, who knew that this was wrong. Judges, business leaders, politicians, right? People who actually had power to potentially come together and stop the rise of a dictator and look at the reasons that they didn't, right? It's too hard, acquiescence, greed, right? There's a lot of reasons they didn't. And Peter closes his book with one of the lessons of this history being, beware the beginnings. But how do you know when it's the beginning, right? And so I think about this a lot, obviously. And I also think about if you lived every moment of your life like it was the beginning, that way lies madness too, right? So I think that's a haunting lesson. It's a lesson, very much rooted in history. And I was saying over and over again, push against hindsight as we look towards this history. But I think looking at, and Deborah Lipstadt is saying this too, the moments to stop, she says this in the documentary, the moment to stop a genocide is before it begins, right? And so that's a similar lesson to beware the beginnings, but I think it's a very important lesson as we encounter this history. Should we end there? Okay, I think we're gonna have to end there, but I will hang around. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific.
Thanks a lot.
I think everybody was seeing
Thanks. Yeah, the lesson.